Welcome everyone to this webinar, the workshop by the Life Science Cluster in Norway and Back Bay Life Science Advisors, which is a member of the cluster. We look very much forward to hearing the reflection by the panels today, and we hope that you will enjoy this day together with us. I will just give you a couple of slides to set the scene and tell you a little bit about the Life Science Cluster before the panels start. The cluster has a vision of developing more life science industry based on Norwegian science. The mission is to do this within the framework of more collaboration, more knowledge sharing, both between academia and industry, and also between private and public sectors. And also we have a goal of creating 5,000 new jobs for the industry within the end of 2023. The cluster has approximately 90 members, a little bit above 90 members, and it spans all the way from large pharmaceutical companies and down to startups formed this year. It also includes institutes, universities, hospitals, investors and other organizations that form part of this ecosystem. And also in this picture, we have picked out those companies that we see as investable companies in the portfolio. And on the x-axis, you can see that market launch is on the middle, which means that development companies are on the left side and companies with a product or solution on the market are on the right side. And even some of the right side also have products on the development, under development. So this is also a very exciting portfolio of companies and also an exciting portfolio of investors. If you kind of turn these playing cards around, you will also see that there are a few investors that repeatedly invest in different sectors or segments of this map. And we look forward to both increase more companies coming out of the exciting science, making sure that this turns into profitable industry and also solutions for society. And also to give you a picture from the Norwegian scene, we have strong milieus on life science in the major university cities and also clusters within health and life science distributed around Norway. And for us as a life science cluster, we are also collaborating and have members all across the country. So with that, I would like to introduce also Jonathan Gerkler, CEO of Back Bay Life Science Advisors. And we very much look forward to, Jonathan, the rest of this afternoon in Oslo and morning in Boston.
Good morning, everybody, and thanks, Hannah-Mette. And so delighted to be a part of this. And Hannah-Mette, I'm just going to personally thank you in front of absolutely everybody for what I know is your tireless approach to, the innovation scene in Norway, which is increasingly robust and has always been just a great contributor. I will say that Back Bay has been involved in the Nordics for forever, since our inception in 2010, and frankly, all of us with who are partners of Back Bay with involvement long prior to that as well. It's interesting to see the change in many ways, all for the positive over the last few years. The Nordic ecosystem and the Norwegian ecosystem, of course, is a very strong part of this, has been characterized by extremely strong science and strong management teams. Pre-pandemic, and this is true of all of Europe, the amount of venture capital, for example, going into the Nordics in Europe was 1/10 that of the United States. One of the silver linings of the pandemic has been obviously the leveling of the playing field with regard to travel, with regard to interactions, and we're seeing a real uptick in the size of rounds and the interest in US-based capital coming into the sectors, and also the ability of companies from the Nordic sectors broadly, Norway certainly, and very much included in that, being able to go cross-border. And that's what today is really about. This is a day of, or a morning, I should say, an afternoon for all of you in Norway, of intimate conversations, of shared experiences. One of my favorite expressions is that good judgment comes from experience, which comes from bad judgment, which I say almost at every one of these webinars. But it's really about just talking about what we've learned, what's important going forward, and the like. Just in terms of the way the morning is going to run, and I'm going to invite my panelists to come in shortly for the first panel, we've actually divided this up into 3 sections today. The first is a section among primarily the partnership at Back Bay Life Science Advisors, but also we're joined by Bjorn Berg, who is a partner at Sherman and Sterling, a law firm based in New York where Bjorn is based, but he's also a Norwegian native, and so we're going to benefit from his cross-border nationalism. But it's really an intimate conversation among the 4 of us about the problems and the issues that we see as companies try to go across the pond, the global issues involved. And then we're dividing it into 2 sections, Medtech and Biotech. And I want to draw a distinction here as well. Interestingly, biotech, biology doesn't matter whether you're in Bergen, Norway, or Bergen County, New Jersey. The biology is the same. MedTech and health tech, however, are 2 very, very different stories, because MedTech and health tech tend to be engineered solutions. And although the MedTech side of it may be the same in regard to anatomy and physiology, the healthcare system side of it is extremely different. So translating from a single payer system in Europe to the heterogeneous and editorially often dysfunctional and confusing US system is a very, very different proposition than translating biology from the Oslo Cancer Cluster to Dana-Farber here in Boston. So we will be exploring that in 2 separate conversations. The MedTech conversation is going to include both US and Norwegian VCs, which will be my pleasure to moderate. And then we'll actually have a discussion with a very seasoned American-based but European experienced CEO of a biotech who's worked extensively throughout. So we're hoping it's a good and fun day for everybody. Again, shared experiences. Please feel free to add comments or questions through the chat room. And I think with that, Hannah, I would be delighted to introduce the first 3 panelists joining me: Greg Benning, Chris Leo, and Bjorn Björk. As I've said, if you guys could turn on your videos, we'll have you come in.
And Jonathan, I would just like to comment also that this is being recorded so that the audience knows also. And
right, and both.
Leave you guys to the panel discussions, and we really look forward to it.
Thanks. And I'm laughing because Hannah Mehta said to me, I guarantee you I forget that I'm going to be recording this. And I have to mention that. And I said, well, if you forget, I won't forget. And of course, I forgot also. But thank you. Yes, this is being recorded. And hopefully those who want to revisit it can do so. And those who are missing it, although they won't hear this comment, can hear it in a few minutes. So Bjorn, Chris, and Greg, so pleased to have you 3 join me. I will say Chris and Greg have been my partners for many, many years at Back Bay, and Greg and I go back even before that, as actually Chris and I do as well. And Bjorn, you are the honorary Back Bay Life Science member for the morning, so delighted to have you here. Let me ask you each to just do very brief introductions of yourselves, and then we'll jump right into the content of the panel. Bjorn, can we start with you?
Sure. Yeah. Hi. So thank you for being an honorary Back Bayan today. But my day job otherwise is as a partner at the Sherman & Sterling, as Jonathan mentioned. It's a large international law firm headquartered in New York, but with offices across the globe, including in Europe. And I happen to be in the finance group, but in the structured finance. So I actually do get to play up and down the capital stack, both with equity-like investments and then debt. So that's my background.
Perfect, and thanks for being here. Chris, let's go to you next.
Sure, thanks, Jonathan. So I'm a managing director here at Back Bay. I've been here since we started the firm, so coming up on 11 years. Been consulting and advising life sciences companies for over 15 years at this point, and started my career in academic research. And like everyone here at Back Bay, work across the sector, pre-commercial companies, early stage companies, large pharma, emerging med tech, and everybody in between.
And Greg.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Greg Benning, and it's been mentioned I'm a partner at Back Bay. Jonathan and I have been working together for over 20 years at this point. I'm a career investment banker, so I come off the finance side of things and have been working with emerging growth companies for exclusively for the last 20 years and for the last 10, all life sciences all the time at Back Bay. And I partner up with our strategy teams. I guess we're about 80% headcount on the strategic advisory, 20% on transactional advisory, but figure out what the right thing to do from an asset standpoint is in terms of developing the asset, getting it to a point of approval, commercialization strategies, and then how do you wrap valuation and financing into that, which is a very kind of integrated approach that Back Bay tends to take to our client work. But yeah, so I spend all of my time working on transactional discussions.
And transactional execution, I will add. So thank you again to the three of you for being here. So I'll start again with an aphorism, or two aphorisms. One is begin with the end in mind. Merely meandering down a path toward discovery, development, commercialization, financing, licensing, partnering, and M&A all tied into that needs a plan. And then in addition to that, controlling the data and controlling the debate, I guess, would be the other maxim that I would say. So Chris, let's start with you in that it doesn't really matter large or small, but maybe I think given that we're really talking about development stage companies a lot today, perhaps focusing a little bit more on the emerging side of the company characteristics. But where have you found in your 11 years with us and many years beyond that, let's talk about the faults, not the positives, even though there are loads of positives. Indication prioritization, market determination, competitive analysis, regulatory analysis. Where have you found people have taken shortcuts that might hurt them? What are your real prescriptions for ensuring that things are covered, even if all the financing isn't there to get things done? Let's start with those thoughts.
Sure. And there's a couple things I think it's worth touching on there. And again, with both of these points, acknowledging that, even if the company has no desire to take the product and the technology all the way to the finish line, I think these 2 points are still critically important. The first is market access. And what I'm not referring to is an in-depth, pricing analysis, but not the nuts and bolts of pricing, but more along the lines of how is this product, how is this technology going to be evaluated by public and private payers? What does that process look like? What is it going to be compared to? How has a payer looked at other assets in that class from a precedent perspective? And, tied to that, for hospital-based products, what is that buying process, particularly with technology and devices? How do you get that product into the hospital? How do you get through the procurement and the materials management, group at a hospital, to make it available for the clinician, right? So understanding those processes, again, it doesn't need to be mapped out from an implementation perspective, but certainly an investor or strategic market access is going to be, top of mind, even for, an earlier stage technology. The second is manufacturing, and not for, this is less critical, obviously, for a small molecule or even an antibody, but having a plan for scaling up manufacturing, if it's a cell or gene therapy, an advanced bispecific antibody or other advanced biologic, mapping out how that can get scaled up for phase 3 and commercial launch. Again, that's I think a roadmap that would be well worth laying out, and having that detailed for discussions, again, with investors, potential investors or strategics.
Yeah, and again, this will be conversational. So Bjorn and Greg, please feel free to jump in. I'd make a comment as well, and I didn't introduce myself fully, and I won't. But I spent a lot of years as an academic surgeon, and and as such was actually a thought leader in my time in a different era. And I still think it's funny. There are a lot of companies, and this can be true on the biotech side. I think it's more true on the medtech side, that still looks to the physician, not only, or the clinician, not only for input into adoptability, but makes the assumption that that clinician is still in control of decision making. And one of the things that's changed pretty dramatically in the 20 years since I've left academic medicine is that the clinician is not in control of decision making. There's input, but the layers of committee, the layers of pricing analysis and decision making and adoption and bundling and the way things are sold is so dramatically different. And I still think there's a reliance too much on the word of the KOL versus the bigger picture, Chris, that you were talking about. Greg, you've got to have seen these pitfalls show up in deal discussions, and yet all the things that Chris mentioned can't necessarily be fully in place as you enter into an earlier stage deal discussion. So how do you get around that? How do you ensure that the company still has a value proposition that's discernible?
Yeah, well, I think in general the two biggest issues that I tend to run into are the alignment of visibility and awareness with prospective funding sources and counterparties on a cross-border basis, and then to what Chris was going to, the preparedness for engaging with those parties, and if from a development or from an operational or from a disclosure standpoint, you really don't have everything properly organized or properly thought through. And it also, the acuteness of those issues varies depending on who you're talking to. If you're talking to a smaller biotech or a smaller medtech company, that's very different than if you're talking to a top 10 pharma or a global med device company, where if they make a decision to greenlight on Diligence, all of a sudden you're going to have 30 or 40 people on the other side asking for things. And understanding transactionally the decision-making process that those types of organizations go through, whether it's M&A, licensing, partnering, strategic venture, option deals, and where along the way somebody has to say, yeah, I'm good here, in order to let somebody else progress it. It's complicated and it's very detail oriented.
Yeah, and we'll dig in a little bit deeper on that in just a little bit. I remember we were doing a deal, I think it was about 5 or 6 years ago, and the data room at one point, I believe, had 73 people in it. It was a big pharma in licensing deal or acquisition. I can't remember what we were dealing with, but it was 73 people in the data room. And all I could imagine was, how do you ever get to a decision with 73 people in the data room? It's just an astonishing fact, but we did, as I recall. Bjorn, as the guest at the Back Bay Thanksgiving dinner here, of course, you've been politely quiet throughout the conversation, but one of the things we've also seen are the landmines that show up, and they can be IP landmines, they can be a previous agreement landmine, they can be a financing and governance landmine. But I know you deal a great deal with structured finance, but your insights extend beyond it. Let's talk about it from your perspective, sitting in New York, but having both feet firmly planted in both countries. What you've seen in terms of, again, the tripwires that you can set off explosions over during these deal discussions.
Yeah, that's kind of a dangerous starting point, because they are countless, and then inevitably they always come where you didn't expect them, because that's why you trip over them. Yep. Now, of course, that said, it's very interesting, because depending on, and speaking from a financing source, and there are sort of a couple of forks in the road that are very important for anyone approaching a global market or coming to New York or London, for that matter, for capital. right? That the starting point is really, am I going down an equity route where you're really disclosing, the future potential, or am I going down a financing route, which is more, fixed income type of financing, where you're really describing the how you have risk mitigants, right, and the downside risk protection, because no banker that is not participating in the upside is going to care that much about how well you do, other than that you do well enough to repay. And then in between, right, where you have upside participation, where it becomes important. So that particular fork in the road will really lead you down different types of diligence, different types of disclosure, and different types of analysis. And then once you are within a framework, the next question then becomes, well, who are you investors? Are you approaching a public market over a private market? In the US, the distinction is really one based on primarily supposedly sophistication. And I say, of course, supposedly, because we all dealt with very wealthy investors that show a remarkable lack of sophistication, but the theory being that they can at least hire necessary sophistication to do their own diligence. And so the disclosure standards lessen as compared to, if you go out broader into the market, and even though we try to have the same standard also for sophisticated investors in terms of disclosure, we do get more comfortable with at least taking a step back and assessing the risk as compared to sort of the ideal public registered deal, which we usually don't see in this space, other than for the largest companies. Now, of course, with the step back here, it's interesting. I usually get a lot of questions around, hot topics, which is currently has been SPACs, right? And so a lot of the biopharmas, they've all been now questioning about the
Never heard of it.
Never heard of it, right?
Wait a minute, we interrupt this conversation for a commercial. Back-Bay's SPAC webinar is coming up, led by Greg and Vasilios at Endpoints. So Bjorn, thank you so much for that commercial interruption. Fantastic.
Yeah, so the first thing they ask is, which celebrity can they hire to promote their SPAC? No, I'm just kidding. But it's interesting because what they have, it's very interesting in terms of what is it that drives a lot of these questions. I always say they ultimately are based on a cultural approach, right? Because they always ask questions based on their experience. When you come anywhere, you have experience, and then you try to compare, your next venture or financing source or approach to what you have experienced in your local market. And SPACs, of course, is new for a lot of people, and also the sort of short version of the U.S. disclosure regimes. They may have heard that, it's you can't have any disclosure about projections, and then in SPACs you have free disclosure projections, none of which is correct, of course, but it's all about safe harbors. It's all about a litigation risk. It's all about exactly what you were starting to get at. How can you try to identify and quantify the risks sufficiently to actually reach your target audience, right? And describe both the known risks, the business, and then describe enough of the risks that you have identified, and then also some of the unquantifiables, so that you feel that the investors feel that some of the information disparity has been addressed, and they're willing to go in and invest, not only based on what they know, but also because they can hopefully then pass on the investment to another investor or lender. And once you reach that stage, then you have a robust kind of both from a legal perspective and from a financing perspective, a robust financing structure, in my experience.
Risk transfer, without question. Greg, you were about to jump in, but I do have a question for all of you.
Well, I think for the people on this call, I think when you see the whole topic of SPACs, just buy your popcorn and enjoy watching. In general, I think it's a space that is, when you think about pre-IPO crossover investing and post-IPO follow-on investing, I mean, one of the more well-targeted de-SPACing transactions, I thought, was the guy behind Medivation, who has a new gig called Nuvation, where he basically said, look, I can go do 3 financings at once, and then I can focus on developing my drugs. That's one thing. Some of the things where, you know, you've got this Facebook alum who's just known as Chamath, who's out there with his IPO ABCDE doing Virgin Galactic, you know, space shuttle rides with projections, and they haven't hit one yet. I think from a risk standpoint and an investor appropriateness standpoint, there are going to be some spectacular explosions in the next few years. I do think it's a chunk of the capital markets that's here to stay, that some very sophisticated life science investors are playing in it. But in general, again, for this group, I think it's just like, it's kind of like, somebody described it to be sort of like junk bonds in the 80s and 90s. It'll settle out and it's going to be permanent, but there's going to be some fireworks.
Well, I'm going to impose moderator prerogative here and get us off SPACs, but I will invite everybody to the June 17th, 10:30 a.m. Back Bay webinar on SPACs. But to kind of knit it together in terms of investor awareness and appropriateness, I think one of the biggest things and one of the best skills that I've seen in terms of transactional preparedness in the Nordics, and I can think of 1 or 2 Norwegian CEOs in particular, just the care that they took, because it's very different to think about. I mean, if you look at funding or M&A, to some degree, it's kind of like big ticket selling. That's very different than the scientific method, with one exception, in that it really tends to benefit thoroughness and preparedness. And, you know, I think one thing that would be worth spending some time talking about is how do you go about building your network in terms of collaboration on the development side, but also understanding, you know, the partnering opportunities and the M&A and funding opportunities, so that when you show up at a JP Morgan or at a Bio, you've got your 24 meetings, and you know, the people that are able to do that put an enormous amount of week by week, month by month effort into positioning what they're working on, so that people are you know, ready to meet with them and know what they're there to talk about. So that's exactly what I wanted to come back to Chris over, was just that point. And I would just ask that everybody please be less shy, okay? Feel free to speak your mind and to really express yourself. So Chris, we were earlier in Joe Biden style, I think, on an open mic talking about the Alzheimer's and the new Biden approval. But again, everything we were saying there was based on public information, of course. But Chris, this really raises the question of something that has been in our fabric since inception, which is the inflection point analysis, the prioritization of indication, and another Back Bay maxim: match the capital to the asset. Make sure you are raising in the right way or partnering in the right way. Talk a little bit about the process you recommend and you execute on when companies actually have a platform. And this is more biotech oriented than medtech, so we'll focus on that for a bit. But it's applicable across the board. You have a platform, you have a technology. You need to really understand the best way to prove it, then replicate it, then scale it, and the financing along each of those lines is different, as Bjorn was saying. Talk to us a little bit about that process, because I think that's a critical question for people to dig into and be prepared, as Greg was just saying as well.
Sure, I think. But prior to even, implementing this type of process, I think it's really important to, as early as possible, and again, this isn't putting a hard stake in the ground, but trying to land on, are you a platform-based company or are you a product-based company, right? Because there are pros and cons and paths forward for both, right? I mean, on the platform side of things, if you take like the classic, antibody companies, the Adimabs of the world, it's okay, we have a superior technology and our model is going to be to enable access to this platform for a wide range of pharma partners, around specific targets, etc. The flip side of that is, okay, we're a product-based company. We are going to leverage the platform to develop molecules in areas of high unmet need and take them to a certain inflection point. And to do that, I do think it gets back to a little bit what we had talked to at the outset is, right, this cannot just be okay, we're going to prioritize indication X because it's a large market, right? There needs to be, in addition to commercial criteria that go into that analysis, there has to be clinical development, technical, feasibility analysis that also goes into it, right? So it's identifying really which indications are going to enable us to get there in a capital efficient manner and get to a point where either we can easily generate further investment or we can exit or partner the program, right? So I think it's really a combination of, what does it need to look like? What are the specifications? What's the product profile need to look like to drive that interest? And how challenging is it going to be to get there? And what does that mean for the financing that you're going to need in place to get to that inflection point? Because certainly you don't want to be in the position where you're 18 months from the inflection point and you're scrambling for capital, right? So again, bottom line is it can't just be driven by market opportunity. It has to really be also considering development feasibility. And is this a space where a partner and or investor will be excited about the opportunity at the point that you can take it to?
I think feasibility is a great word. Bjorn, go ahead. I was just going to ask you something else.
I was just about to say, just that the exit, the ability to identify the exit is probably key to the financing, unless you sort of have as a strategy to generate enough income to repay your financing, which we generally, don't. The exit strategy, the exit point, and having everybody on board with that, and what that market will look like, that is the key to financeability.
It's again getting back to the idea of starting with the end in mind and working backwards, right? I mean, and I think having that plan, right, even if who knows how the world can change, but having that plan will give you a lot more optionality and flexibility to pursue different options, as you go along the development path.
One of the pieces of advice, and I think it's really a double-edged sword. And our founding principle was just that inflection point analysis, and I think that's true for every investor. If you come up with a case for investment and you don't know what your exit is, you're not doing your job as an investor either, or for that matter, as a company acquiring or in licensing. The flip side of that, though, I was sitting in the office of a head of corp dev at a very major Boston-based medical device company some years back, and the phone rang, and he picked up the phone and spoke briefly, hung up the phone, turned to me and said, "Sorry about that. If I had $5 for every company that called me up and said they had built their product solely for me to acquire, I would have retired a long time ago." So I do think you have to begin with the end in mind, but also without question have sustainability as part of your plan, because the best competitive element you can have is that you don't need to do a deal. And that involves capital, and that involves licensing, partnering, M&A, and these days in the public markets. So we're coming up against time. I want to ask each of you one question in terms of your best advice, or just a parting thought. But let me ask it around the following. Nordic CEOs tend to come from a culture that's very different, and I say this with nothing but compliments intended, than some of the brash self-promotional behavior you can sometimes see in and around some of the more prominent Boston-based ecosystems. What advice would you give about bridging the gap between the tendency to be inclusive and more less overstated in a Nordic culture, in terms of raising capital in the United States. And so Bjorn, I'll start with you because again, you are on both sides. How do you bridge that gap?
Yeah, so here's something of note, and that is every CEO I have spoken with generally, their job is to promote the company and be as optimistic as you can be. So if you're understated as a CEO, it looks like it's not that much of a prospect. At the same time, when you are really talking about downside risk and risk mitigation, you need to talk to a CFO or COO type. Now, as a CEO, you might be able to wear all three hats, but you have to signal when you wear which hat. But having the ability to actually sell your company and your product and tell the optimistic story, I think is key. And then you can have somebody else with you that will talk about how you're mitigating risk if necessary. But don't be shy. As long as you are accurate and not misleading. This is still
accuracy. I'm not shy. Chris?
Yeah, no, I get. I mean, it's fine to be shy. I think it's more important to just, have the value proposition for the technology, carry the day, right? It's just being able to succinctly define to a potential investor or partner, what is your competitive differentiation versus the other, 16 next gen IO platforms that they're going to look at. So again, I don't think you need to be overly gregarious, but really having the story on, okay, this is how we're different. This is our value proposition versus everybody else. So to me, that carries the day. Great.
And Greg, you can comment on this chain or just leave us with your final thoughts as well, and then we'll move on to the next panel.
I think they're probably one and the same. I mean, when you think about what you want to turn the company into, and you go out and you do your homework and you get feedback from people saying this is what they're looking for, I think paying attention to that in terms of inflection point from an investor or a counterparty standpoint, and then going after that from an awareness and a need building marketing angle. I think just take a look at what you consider to be the best class players in the space, and do it the way they do it. And I think to Chris's point, there needs to be underlying substance both in terms of technology and in terms of unmet need. But look at it from that perspective. And honestly, that's something that we do an awful lot of for our clients. Probably like 2/3 of our work is repeat business, where there's something going on and we're keeping the client in front of investors and counterparties. And when the time's right, it comes together really quick. But there's an awful lot of just put yourself in the other person's shoes and address the needs that they have.
And as we all know, overnight sensations usually take about 10 years to develop. So thank you all, Chris, Greg, and Bjorn. Bjorn, you're welcome to be at the family table anytime. What a pleasure to have you as part of this. And I think we'll shift over now to the MedTech, HealthTech investor conversation. So again, Greg, Chris, and Bjorn, thank you. And Antova, Mark, and Dan, please join us by video. And Dan and Antova, I think you're muted, so come on and join.
Hi, everybody.
There you are. Nice to see you.
Likewise.
So again, I'm going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves. But the intent of this panel is actually to dig in on the MedTech and HealthTech side. I think we just spent a fair amount of time talking about biotech, although it was translatable across sectors and stages. But now I have the pleasure of two US VCs, one of whom is my partner in a fund in which I'm also a partner, Mark Goldberg, which I have not emphasized today, and also Antova, who is the lead life science investor and investment director at Norinvest. So again, cross-border in orientation. And we'll dig into a variety of things around just the perspectives on both sides of the pond, again, with the underlying assumption that indeed the pandemic has changed things just as it has in healthcare delivery, which we will get into today as well. And it certainly has changed things in investment dynamics. So let me start by just asking the panelists to introduce themselves. Antova, if we can start with you, and we'll move to Dan and Mark.
Thanks. Good to meet you all. So I'm Antova Kongsnes, working as an investment director at Investinor, heading the health sector team. Investinor has a portfolio of 20 companies within health, including pharma, biotech, medtech, and digital health companies, all in different stages, from very early stage to listed company. We listed, our last listing we did on Nasdaq New York. I have had the pleasure of working with tech companies and tech founders for more than 20 years, focusing on venture investments and being an active owner. And my experience is mainly from building teams, involvement in strategy processes, M&As, IPOs, and exits. So that's briefly about me. Today I'm, of course, working as board members in several of our portfolio companies in different stages as well.
Terrific, and we'll dig into a number of your activities on this 25-minute session. Dan, welcome. Nice to see you, and please give a brief introduction of yourself as well.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan, for having me. Hi, everybody. Dan Geberman, I'm a partner at Flare Capital. Flare Capital is a Boston-based venture capital firm. We only invest in healthcare software and services. We have about $500 million under management, and most of our capital we've raised from large healthcare corporations, some of the largest national payers, large delivery systems, pharma, med device, and lab companies are also investors in our fund. My personal background, I'm a physician by training. I trained at the Mass General Hospital and practiced there in internal medicine for about 10 years. I worked at a payer, the Harvard Pilgrim Health Plan in Boston, as a medical director running pop health analytics and general strategy before I joined my firm in 2015. Good to be here.
Dan, what division were you in of the MGH? I forgot about that we share that DNA.
So I was in the hospital medicine division.
Which shows you how old I was. It didn't exist when I left the MGH in 2001. But we'll compare notes later on that geography offline. Mark, your turn.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, and thank you for everyone for allowing me to join. It's a pleasure to be here. Besides being Jonathan's partner, I am the co-founder and managing partner of BioVentures Investors Medtech Funds. We're a 20-something-year-old venture capital fund with over 400 million in assets under management across what's now 5 funds. We invest exclusively in the medical technology area, which we basically broadly define as anything that's not a therapeutic drug. So it's devices, diagnostics, digital health in particular. My background is I am a almost 40-year veteran of the life science industry, having started in the early days of the biotech industry in Boston, before there was a biotech industry in Boston. Helped to build that, and then about 20 years ago, helped to launch BioVentures. So with that, Jonathan, back to you.
Great, thanks. And Mark has been at this, as he said, for almost 40 years. He was the most precocious 7-year-old in venture capital that we've. Okay, that's clearly not the case, but that's all right. But you look terrific. Anyway, so Antova, I want to actually start with you, because I think a lot of the companies, we've just been hearing a great deal about inflection point and controlling the debate and beginning with the end in mind. That was really the theme of the first fireside discussion that we had around the partner table in the last piece of this. But a lot of the companies will look to you first before they start to traverse the ocean and start to look to the US markets. And you're both enabling capital, you're enabling advice, et cetera. So critically important in your environment that I think people understand what you need to look for, what the criteria are that you can apply. So I'd love an overview from you, if you could, just introducing your concepts and how you approach it. And then we'll compare and contrast. I'm sure there's a huge amount of overlap between you and what happens on this side of the pond as well.
Yeah, thanks. I will be happy to. I think as a start, I will take just a brief introduction to Investinor. as a background. And we have 1.1 billion US dollar. I need to think in dollar now, under management. And historically, we have focused on direct investments in early stage venture companies. From last year, we also have a fund-in-fund activity, as you mentioned. We are the largest venture investor in Norway, owned by the Norwegian government, but investing on the same terms and acting like a private investor. Have a portfolio of 70 companies altogether, and in our direct investment fund, including, as I said, early stage, venture stage, and also more expansion growth stage. Main sectors and portfolio are within ICT and health, but also investments within other sectors important for Norway. So back to your question. First of all, in the due diligence processes, we ensure that the target company has defined a strong value proposition, and that that they can express what they are doing to the what they are going to do for mankind with passion. We need to understand that the product or the technology makes a meaningful difference. What's the uniqueness versus medical needs and competitors, of course. Secondly, they must have understood the regulatory framework and have a robust go-to-market plan. Early stage companies are normally driven by scientific and technological parameters rather than the need to perform proper documentation of the invention so that meaningful clinical claims can be approved. So very early ask those questions. That's important for us. We also like the involvement of opinion on KOLs at early stage. Also very important for us is, of course, the management and advisory teams involved in the development. So we try to make sure and ask the right questions. We think, at least, to secure that the teams have the relevant expertise from Medtech. So preferable teams with background experience from the industry. And also to that point, it's important for me to say that we generally are very focused on diversity of teams because we think that will give better results, of course. So discussions early on that incorporate different viewpoints is something we also believe is quite powerful tools early on in developing startups. Is it more? Yeah, well, of course, last but not least, we are always looking for a strong investment consortium and preferable with relevant experience. And we are, to be honest, we are focusing more and more on building strong investment consortiums very early in the processes. And by that meaning both the competence they bring to board, but also follow-up capital, really to be able to take out the potential of the company, to run fast enough. So that's reflections we are doing when looking at deals within health in general, of course, but also talking now about more medtech cases.
You know, and we'll stay focused on medtech and health tech today. But I do appreciate that what you've said are principles that apply across the board. So you've just outlined something that I think is probably near and dear to all of us in terms of diligence processes, and the syndication is another question. That may be a great segue to move to your American counterparts. Dan, I'm going to come to you last because I really want to get your thoughts about specifically the healthcare sector. But let me shift it to Mark initially. And incidentally, as I said to the previous panel, which was comprised of a partnership that's worked together for 11 years, so there was zero problem with them interrupting each other all the time. Please feel free to interrupt each other all the time. You're not as used to interrupting as perhaps we were on the previous panel, but don't hesitate. But Mark, to shift to you first for a second, diligence processes don't really differ across the pond, but there are some real issues around syndication, previous investors, board issues, you name it, you can speak to it. Talk a little bit about the challenges, because I think what Antova just really articulated was the need to build implicitly an international syndicate for a number of these companies, and yet there are challenges for both sides in doing so. And you've certainly worked across Europe a great deal. Would love your thoughts about where those challenges exist. And then Dan, I want to come back to you specifically on the health tech challenges of translating Norwegian or Nordic or European to the American system. But so Mark, let me please start with you.
Super. And I would say there were two groupings of challenges. There's a grouping of what I would call overall challenges. As you're looking at a medtech company, what things are in particular do we think about and how do we think about it? And then two, when you're dealing with a company that is thinking about coming into the US market and having a US syndicate partner, what are some of the challenges that are specific to that? Let me start with the more generalized medtech issues. The prior discussion on exit was, I thought, absolutely spot on. You can't invest as an investor unless you have a reasonable idea how you're going to get out. Because our job is very simple. We collect money from other people and we have to give more money back to them. So we have to have successful exits. It's a really simple business proposition. And that means that we are always thinking about ultimately not who the single buyer is, because that never works, but why is this important for either offensive or defensive reasons to a series of buyers in a particular sector? And what's the data package they need to see? And so many times we get approached with companies whose management teams say, we need so much money to get through the next 12 months. That's not how we think about it. We think about, what do you need to get from where you are today to an exit, and what does that exit look like in terms of the data package that an acquirer needs to see? And so thinking about it, not just in the short term, but methodically all the way through, how do you do key work in terms of de-risking what you have and thereby increasing value? And how do you do that from milestone to milestone? And how do you think about financing each of those milestones, whether all at once, or if you're early stage, likely over several rounds of financing? Second key issue is that this is not a world of a better mousetrap. Having a 7th generation improved knee replacement from a venture standpoint is not an ideal way to make money. You really want something that will have an impact, and most importantly, is going to be adopted. So understanding that adoption, both locally and internationally, and what drives adoption is going to be important. If it's a truly innovative change in clinical practice, which you can forecast adoption, more often than not, those get acquired before you even market the product. But that acquirer is still thinking about adoption. How are they going to drive revenue? Because that's how they value the company. And so, thinking about the exit, thinking about the clinical utility, thinking about, is it really a positive paradigm change in terms of how doctors will do something that's better for them, better for the patient, and also important, more efficient for a system, because you're dealing with a world in which demographically You have a growing and aging population, and you have to deliver more healthcare to more people more efficiently, because no matter where you are in the world, governments do not have an unlimited amount of money to spend on healthcare. So that's sort of an overall generalized framework. Thinking about sort of that cross-border issue, Jonathan, that you mentioned, really then centers on a number of other more specialized issues. How do you think about building the right kind of board? What's the expertise that's needed? What's the right syndication? Now, it's not just money, but it's expertise in that particular sector. And then lastly, and this is something that we see often when people are coming into the US, there are different dynamics in terms of adoption in the US. It is not a single payer system. So the change from a single payer system to the US multi-payer system with all of its complexities is something that really has to be thought through. And so being able to look at what's happening in a particular country such as Norway, and then being able to say, how can that be translated into the US in terms of clinical adoption and payment, becomes a critical issue in terms of our evaluation. So I've been long-winded, been done a monologue, so I will stop here and let you move on.
So, what's great is that I think we could probably all talk for about 3 hours about these issues, but we do have a somewhat short leash. So this is going to end up being a series of speeches. And Dan, you get to actually do the plenary speech at the end of the meeting, which I'm delighted for, since you were really kind enough to join us. So Mark and Tava just spoke to, I think, issues broadly across medtech and health tech, but obviously health tech, which we certainly incorporate into our medtech investment thesis, is a very different animal in terms of infrastructure, in terms of translatability, integration, et cetera. And I know you deal a lot with large data, but you also deal a lot, as we understand Flare Capital, with some of the critical issues of patient care across the system. And you've been in it from both an investor perspective and an operator perspective, working within the system. Tell us where you really see those pitfalls, especially in translatability from a computer science product perspective into a real world medical delivery perspective.
Yeah, no, thanks, Jonathan. And I'll pick up on something that Mark, just mentioned, the problem with adoption. You could think of, kind of getting something to market in 3 phases. First, you have to create the product. And I might argue in health tech, the stakes are that much higher because you're building software. There aren't that many barriers to entry. There isn't this IP that can be completely protectable. And therefore, the go-to-market and the speed to execution is increasingly important. And as we talked about a little bit before, there is such a diversity of buyer group in the United States, $3 trillion healthcare market. Mark talked a little bit about the multi-payer system. There's a lot of concentration in payers. The top 5 payers hold about 44% of the US population. But then there are also large provider groups who are a defined buying segment. There are self-insured employers, which have hundreds of billions of dollars of buying power. There are direct-to-consumer business models that are starting to kind of get a lot of traction. And so I think if you have a product, you have to first figure out who are you going to sell to. When we talk about pitfalls, when I see an early stage company in their go-to-market slide, they talk about how they're going to sell to all 4 different channels. When I see that, I internally think, well, they have no go-to-market strategy, because it's so hard to sell into each of these different sectors, given the need set and product market fit can be different in each of these channels. And then I think that the final mile is once you're actually able to, kind of segment your customer base, you're actually able to get to some form of enterprise contract. Just because you have, quote unquote, the right to get reimbursement, that doesn't mean that people will actually use your product, that you will actually generate revenue. In many ways, I like to say that when you get a contract, you now have a hunting license. You ultimately have to drive adoption. You actually have to get utilization by patients, by clinicians, by other, kind of enterprise stakeholders, and really to drive the enterprise value that ultimately, entrepreneurs and investors are looking for.
Sure. Let me ask you one other question, and then we will wrap up. But one of the comments that's very clear is that we have probably 4 EMRs only in the United States. And I think that a lot of people don't understand that, we have a large integrated delivery network system. We have a hub and spoke system for the majority of hospitals, maybe not for rural hospitals, and that there are actually only a few basic infrastructure backbones that are used by that. And so therefore, we're going to need to have companies that are developing an innovative adjunct to healthcare delivery or data analysis and what have you, still fit in with that. What, just briefly, because I know we're running a little bit short on time, Dan, what do you do and what do you recommend companies do in regard to diligence to that really vexing fact for many developers?
Yeah, no, it's an important point, and I think a core component of any form of technological solution that's going to come to market in the United States is this concept of interoperability, right? Ultimately, you need to be able to connect with the data sources. You need to be able to interpret and analyze that data, and then you need to be able to surface that data back to the user in a usable fashion, whether that be an enterprise business user or a patient-facing consumer app. And so interoperability is really important. And I think from a regulatory perspective, we are reducing the historical barriers and silos to accessing this data. And so I do think there's a big opportunity for companies that do come to market, if they are able to tap into these data sources. Ultimately, that is a core critical kind of buying component. The ability to provide decision support to buyers is extremely important.
Terrific, thank you. And I know we're running out of time. Questions are starting to come in. We'll have a section where we'll answer questions toward the end of it. So Mark, Antova, and Dan, first of all, thank you. I'm going to just summarize 3 things that I think are really critically important in this. One, to Mark's earlier comment, venture capitalists' job is to return capital to their investors. And as the way we do that is with innovation and innovation support and translation and the capital needed to bring a company forward. And the ideal partner, company and VC, is when we are aligned in common purpose to meet our different results, which is for the company to really bring something spectacular to the market, for the investor to have a return on investor. And we should never lose sight of that need for alignment, but also the still disparity sometimes between motivations. Secondly, Antova, I want to comment on one of your statements, and I know that Norway has really led the way here on diversity, not merely as a social construct, but actually as a business construct, that it is exceedingly valuable to have different points of view and different perspectives present inside of a company. And it's a great business proposition. And of course, the social imperative has a whole nother conversation around it. And that will lead me back to something I think implicit in what Dan is saying that really has been exposed by the pandemic, which is that healthcare equity has really been emphasized by the fact that in our technology, we have a technology gap in the United States as well. And in the ability to bring technology that is really utilizable by a system and can reach all patients efficiently, there's also, again, another imperative there socially that turns into a great business construct as well. So I think everything we've talked about today has all of these wonderful joined motivations inherent. So Antova, Mark, and Dan, we're going to shift to the next panel, which I'll introduce in a moment. But really, let me thank the 3 of you so much for being a part of this today, and I'm sure the audience appreciates it deeply as well.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having us.
Cheers.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you all. And let me now invite Pete Bach, Dave Mazzo, and Crystal Shu to join, and I will go off video. But the last section here prior to the wrap up and the question is the biotech side of this equation. And Pete, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself and Dave and Crystal as well, but let me just leave by saying you guys are in great hands with what will be, I'm sure, a very interesting discussion. And I'll be back soon. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Jonathan. And so during the first 2 sessions, really the focus was on preparation for not only financing, but for the exit. And what we've done today is asked Dave Mazzo, a very seasoned biotech executive and CEO, to really give the perspective on the other side of the seat, so to speak. So we'll be discussing a little bit more on, from his perspective, pitfalls, best practices, and experience in cross-border transactions and preparations. And also I've invited my colleague Crystal Shu from Back Bay to join as well. Just briefly before I introduce the other panelists here, my name is Pete Bach, as Jonathan said. I'm a managing director with Back Bay. I've been with the firm for about 8.5, 9 years at this point, and like many of the senior partners, have an academic background, came out of academia where I trained as an immunologist and cancer biologist. We'll end with Dave, so I'll quickly introduce Crystal. She's a senior consultant here at Back Bay. Crystal, would you like to quickly introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone. Like Pete said, I'm senior consultant with Back Bay. I have been with Back Bay for about 2.5 years. Was at another consulting firm for a few years prior to that, and graduated from Emory University down in Atlanta. So very excited to be here. And Dave, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Crystal.
And Dave, we're delighted to have you here. Dave is the CEO of Caladrius, and a very seasoned and well-traveled biotech executive and CEO. So Dave, would you like to tell the audience a little bit more about yourself?
Sure, thank you. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, Pete and Crystal, and thank you for having me. By way of background, I'm actually a chemist by training, and my experiences in the international arena started right out of graduate school. I did a postdoc at the École Polytechnique Fédérale in Switzerland, and then returned to the United States, where I joined Big Pharma. Worked in Big Pharma for approximately 18 to 20 years, but a good portion of that was actually spent with Ron Poulenc-Rohr as the head of pharmaceutical development, based out of their Paris research and development facilities. So we've lived in Paris. I've had responsibilities for operating groups throughout Europe, Asia, and of course the United States and Canada. And in around 2001, 2002, I made the transition from Big Pharma executive leadership into emerging pharma, and it was a very interesting transition. And having made that transition, I'm very pleased to be in the world of emerging pharma. It's very exciting, dynamic, at times challenging, but that's also been a place where I've had the opportunity to work internationally with companies, again, in the Far East, in Canada, and of course in Europe as well. So I've had a lot of experience dealing with different business cultures, different ethnic cultures, and just the idea of cross-border transactions is something that I've had an opportunity to experience quite a bit.
Great, thank you. And so, obviously you have a lot of experience running international businesses, as well as sort of, assessing and evaluating licensing or M&A opportunities cross borders. So maybe you could just, start at a high level from your experience. What, when you were interacting with a counterparty, and maybe, thinking about those that you've interacted with in, Europe broadly, and to the extent you can, provide color, the Nordics specifically, what do they frequently miss? What's, what are the gaps? What frequently do you find yourself counseling them on?
I think, from my perspective, the most glaring gap often comes from a misalignment of expectations and or experiences. I mean, and that's not unique to just the Nordic countries. It's basically any other ex-US counterparty, and sometimes even within the United States, East Coast versus West Coast. Sure. You have these issues, but people come to to the party with certain levels of expectation based upon their own perspectives and experiences, and they forget that oftentimes when you're dealing with small companies who are at the cutting edge of innovation, there aren't the same level of, or isn't rather the same level of let's say, detail or precision in every step of the process, and you have to have a certain amount of openness and a willingness to look at things. It's somewhat like buying, if I can use this analogy, which is probably international in nature. It's like buying a house when you're walking into a construction site. and
Sure.
you see the frame of the house, but the walls aren't up yet, the windows aren't in, certainly there's no furniture or decoration, and you have to use your imagination about, not only what could this house look like, but what can I do to help this house be completed in the way that I envision it. And that's how we kind of approach our partnerships. We should be looking at that. When you look at a project, you look at it and say, okay, I see the framework. Now,
Yeah.
what can we do collectively to build this project into something that will make sense internationally, and to address some of the things that the other panelists said, to focus on not just doing a science project, but on creating a product that will have commercial appeal across the international arena.
Yeah, and maybe to extend that analogy, from your experience, right, is where is that vision and frame or part of the house, really well done frequently, and where there are gaps, right? Are people usually good electricians or plumbers, or is it more of an issue with drywall and framing and that?
Well, what I've found, as being in the on the biotech side,
yeah,
being sort of the sell side, if you will, right? So
Sure.
we're looking to partner with folks, and oftentimes those bigger companies are coming in. Those bigger companies, look at us and they expect us to be, sort of the complete set of trades, to continue with
Yeah.
this silly metaphor, but really what we often are, we're great, people at building the foundation and framing the house,
Yeah.
but all the other stuff, sort of the details. So I liken this back. I use this quote a lot, which I attribute to Roy Vagelos. And, I started my career at Merck, and I remember Roy kind of, espousing this, and that was, kind of do the last experiment first, right? Go in, if you're developing a new technology, do the experiment that will demonstrate that it actually has utility where you want to apply it, that you can actually turn it into a product. Then you can go back in and fill in all the blanks that are required for regulatory and or commercial success. But sort of starting in what would have been traditionally the big pharma approach from 20 or 30 years ago, and taking that sequence doesn't work in our world. First of all, we don't have the capital to do it, and typically we don't have the time. So I think we take the we build the framework and we make sure that it's solid, and then determining how it's going to be decorated and fitted out is something that needs to be done with the partner, and that can be really, really well done and exciting if the partner happens to be another small innovation company looking to partner, because then you come at this with similar mentalities, similar perspectives, and you often know what you don't know, which is not the case with a lot of big pharma partners.
Yeah. And you talked a little bit about, the sort of regulatory and commercial, when you think about maybe from where you sit interacting with global pharma, right? What do you feel when you are having those discussions is, what's mission critical, what's nice to have, what questions do you absolutely need to be able to answer versus, are acceptable for that, ongoing dialogue?
So one of the things, Pete, that I took from my big pharma education, if you will, is the rigor around, at the beginning of a project, the concept phase, putting together a target product profile. Basically, what is it that we want to develop? What needs are we looking to meet? And what does the competitive environment demand of this new product in order for it to be successful? Again, going back to the previous panel, whether it's venture capitalists or just people in the public markets, investors are looking to make money, and they typically don't make a lot of money on, Me Too's, the 7th or 8th generation of a new product. What they're looking for is real innovation and disruptive technologies. And so I think it's important that when you're developing something like that, you understand what it is that it has to do in order to be successful. And a lot of small companies, just haven't had that experience in developing that rigor and understanding that goes beyond just, a clinical definition or or a medical target label. It goes into understanding what will be necessary to attract KOLs, what the payers are going to want, what will the commercial environment be when you hope to launch, and what will you have to do to be successful and make money. And that involves manufacturing. It involves the entire gamut of things. And that's something that I think is often overlooked. There's a really strong focus on the science.
Sure. Yeah.
And maybe a thought process that says everything else will follow. But that's not really the way it works.
Yeah. And maybe I'm going to jump in here and ask Crystal to provide her experience, not only from time at Back Bay, but her previous organization that really did focus on later stage assets and pricing and market access in that realm. And Crystal, hearing David talk about sort of getting that TPP together and questions about how payers are going to look at it, maybe you could provide a little bit of context, specifically on how we counsel, specifically European companies as that TPP is evolving, sort of the granularity and questions that we try to get them to answer about the pricing and market access side of things, and how that's going to evolve as the product or technology develops and progresses through the clinic.
Yeah, and that's why I think, at my previous firm, we did a lot more payer research. I think when you're looking at very early assets, you're typically thinking about it at a much higher level, because at the end of the day, you show a payer a TPP for a product that's in, phase 1, and you're excited about the mechanism. And at the end of the day, all they want to see is the data. And that's what they will be basing their decision on. And so understanding that we can have a discussion with them on, hypotheticals, we can give them a base case and we can give them an upside. But at the end of the day, you go to a payer with a mechanism, and it can be a difficult discussion to have because they want to see outcomes. And I think also, the outcomes that they're focused on here is a little bit different in terms of what they focus on in Europe. And so that's something that we also try to get them to understand, is that you can go on about your health economic benefits, but at the end of the day, that's not something that a payer here will really be considering in their decision. So I think it's helping them understand what payers here really care about, and that, as your data evolves, it could very well potentially change. And so again, don't do a lot of payer research at Back Bay just because of the kind of the early nature of the assets that we work with here.
And
but
I
again,
think,
always a high level focus that we want to consider.
And I think what's interesting is to that point, whether it's under diligence, helping, somebody on the sell or buy side, or, if it's helping crafting the development story and sort of marrying the commercial benefits of the platform or asset to the optimal path through the clinic, sometimes it depends on the therapeutic area too, right? From the payer and pricing and commercial story. And sometimes, if it's an oncology, and many times it does fall to that question of, well, let's see how the data shakes out, in most cases, versus other areas like, anti-infectives, where, even if you're have a pre-IND asset, the first question the counterparty is going to ask you is what's your payment model and how are you going to get this paid for in the current environment?
Yeah, and to that point, I think you talk to enough payers where you also understand, what do they wish could happen versus what will happen in reality. So I think this happens a lot in oncology, and you talk to them and they say, we're going to manage it this way and this way and this way. And at the end of the day, there is very little management in a lot of these spaces, because they don't want to be the one that tells a patient that they can't have a therapy. And there are a lot of advocacy boards. And so I think it's also teasing out what is realistic versus what they wish could happen.
Yeah.
And so I guess, Dave, a question for you. You mentioned that, a lot of times it is easier maybe working with companies of a similar size. And so kind of, again, not to drag on the analogy, but do you find that with companies that are more similar to you, maybe what you guys are, what the value that you guys can offer maybe is more similar? And so sometimes there's a case where you do need to work with bigger pharma where maybe they can offer, resources or capital that a company similar to yours maybe can't.
Well, and that's the trade-off, Crystal. On the one hand, you have, if you're working, and of course these are all stereotypes. I mean, every company is somewhere along the spectrum and at different points, in time. But generally speaking, the characterization of smaller companies as being more nimble, less bureaucratic, better to accelerate things is true. And that is a difficult mindset to take into a partnership with a traditional very big company where they have a hierarchy of committees to take decisions, and it takes sometimes weeks to get a decision taken, when in a small company the hierarchy is two people and they talk to each other and the decision's taken that afternoon. So that can be an issue, and that's a disadvantage with big companies that often is not the case with small companies who are used to sort of doing things in an improvisational way and moving in a very flexible fashion. On the other hand, you made a very good point. Two small companies coming together traditionally don't have the same arsenal of resources that the marriage of a big company and small company would bring. So, big pharma brings, hordes of people, typically lots of capital and lots of experience, right? So, and of course, managing the mechanisms to tap into all that is a bit of the challenge, but that's the benefit of working with those big companies. And if you can find a big company where the team that's assigned as your counterpart acts and thinks like a small company, but has at their disposal the resources of a big company, then that's the ideal scenario, right? Or the counterparty might be a situation that, if I can do a little self-promotion, that we at Caladrius now find ourselves in, where we have quite a bit of cash on our balance sheet. And we have more than $110 million in cash on our balance sheet, which gives us the opportunity to bring resources to bear, at least similar, certainly not at the same magnitude as a Merck or Sanofi or someone, but certainly similar to other medium-sized companies, and that gives us the opportunity to marry with a smaller company and contribute resources to the merger that would allow for things to go in a way that might only have happened in a bigger company merger. So that's the other thing to look for.
Yeah, and I think that's a great segue into my next question in terms of shifting to the role of U.S. biotech in engaging with attractive technologies in the Nordics. So what do you believe is kind of the opportunity of emerging biotech class offers young private or Nordic exchange public companies in terms of a partnership or potential for growth?
Well, and I think some of these things may be obvious, but perhaps some not so. I mean, among the obvious benefits of partnering with certainly a public U.S. biotech company is access to the U.S. public markets. Notwithstanding the fact that there is capital available across the world, and I, for one, would be remiss if I didn't note that all of my previous companies, as well as my current company, I have accessed capital in the Nordic countries, as well as throughout Europe and Japan, China, Hong Kong, Singapore. So there is capital outside the United States, no question about it. But I still think that the U.S. healthcare capital market is the most mature and perhaps the one that has the largest pool of available capital. And that's important. So if you can get access to that capital, that usually funds growth. The other thing is the access to large networks of technology innovators, whether they be through academic institutions or through other companies in the same ecosphere. So that's important. It's bigger in the United States. It's a more mature environment. And so if you have that opportunity, just the network of other CEOs, other CSOs, CMOs, academicians, universities, technology transfer, it just gives you an opportunity to really reach out and talk to a greater diversity of people and have access to things that you wouldn't have in a smaller ecosystem. And so that it's really just a question of scale. I think the other thing is right now, this idea of being able to be on the forefront of science. I personally look toward the Nordic countries as being a place where a lot of other people haven't really spent a lot of time yet. And so they don't recognize the quality of the science, the level of innovation, and even to some extent the maturity of some of the companies in terms of product development. And I think that makes for really interesting potential partnerships with a company like ours, for example.
Yeah, and I think I do want to be conscious of time here, but maybe I think that's a great segue to the next question. It's something that, as we're advising companies, we always get asked, and that's, you know, maybe with your hat on as a buyer now, you know, when and how should, you know, these companies begin to engage with you know, a potential counterparty, even if there isn't, you know, a direct board remit for a M&A process or a license, but how do you sort of, you know, sow the seeds and set the foundation, as it were, maybe to go back to the house?
Well, I'll pick up on the words you used, and again use a very, you know, cliche metaphor, but it's a lot like farming. So, you know, you don't harvest a crop if you've never, you know, prepared the field, planted the seeds, nurtured, you know, watered, nurtured, weeded, and everything. And that's what it is in terms of preparing for partnerships or M&A. I would recommend that they engage early and often, even if they're not in active sell mode, because what they are is an active introduction mode. I mean, you're always selling your brand, your technology, your product, even if it's not for sale for a price right now. You're spreading the word, and I think that's really important. So I would encourage, you know, small companies to participate in events like this, other international conferences, especially now that so many things are being done virtually. It makes it less expensive and a lot easier to do. But it's important to just interact, engage, talk to people who are working in a similar field, and just, you know, plant seeds basically and see what grows.
Yeah, great. So I know we're coming up at the bottom of the hour here, Dave, and very much appreciate you taking the time to join us this morning / afternoon. Any final words of counsel, maybe for, you know, an EU-based company that's looking to really, you know, start engaging with a US-based company?
The only thing I would say, and again, not to be too cliche, is that, you know, many ex-US companies have this stereotypical vision of what the US biotech market is, or what US biotech companies are, you know, and it's this combination of, you know, cutthroat sort of shark mentality, you know, of running too fast and not analyzing sufficiently, of not being conscious of people and culture and so on. And that's, you know, that's obviously an over exaggeration. I think that, you know, the trepidation, if there is any, about engaging with the United States and their companies in our biotech sector really should be modulated. There shouldn't be any trepidation. It's no different than any other place in the world where you encounter different personalities, and, you know, the more people you meet, the more likely you are to find a potential partner with whom you'll feel comfortable. So I would just encourage them to, you know, to reach out and have an open mind, because I do think that there are some very interesting things that could be done together between companies in the Nordic countries and the United States.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Well, we'll leave it at that, and also leave you with our thanks for joining us today, Dave.
Appreciate the time and the opportunity. Wish you all well. Take care.
Great. Thanks. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Jonathan.
Thank you, Pete. And I'm reappearing, as is Hannah Mehta. So, Pete, very much appreciate your closing us out with that wonderful panel, and thanks to Dave and Crystal as well for being a part of that. So, Hannah Mehta, I think we probably have some. I know I've had a couple of questions come in, which I'm happy to read and address, but let me turn it back to you first before I do so.
Yes, thanks. I really appreciate these sessions and the insights that you're bringing to the Norwegian and Nordic companies. And from the first session, talking about the cultural differences and promoting your company and be as positive as you can be, that's really pinpointing differences between Nordic way of presenting and also the US way of presenting, to really understand the difference.
Yeah.
It's very culturally anchored to be modest in the Nordic way of presenting, but you need to be as positive as you can be. So definitely tell the truth, but be be as positive as you can be. That was a very good take-home message, I think. And also I like that suggestion and thinking about like comparing it to buying a house, which is not yet finished. That's another one also.
So I make a couple of comments, and one in terms of the issue of, and I was asked this question. I gave a keynote address at the NOME meeting. I think it was the Nordic Organization for Mentoring and Entrepreneurship, about two and a half years ago. It was about a year before the pandemic. And I do not speak Danish or Norwegian in any way whatsoever, except for a few catchphrases here and there. But somebody asked me about a word that I always butcher, which is janteloven, in terms of the issue of self-promotion versus collectivism in Nordic culture versus US culture. Fortunately, I knew very well about the philosophy and I was able to answer the question. So yes, if there's a lack of passion, regardless of who it is, that will have a negative impact on fundraising or transactional behavior. But we should never lose sight of the fact that on the other side, that when somebody comes in with overstated expectations, with unrealistic basis for what is being promoted and is overtly self-promotional in the absence of data supporting that, it's actually more negative than being overly modest. And so I think, it cuts both ways in terms of culture. And I think my counsel, accounting for different, characteristics of people and national cultures and all of that, is that if we're all just honest, if we're enthusiastic, if we are passionate about what we do, and we are data-driven and well-grounded, that actually will prevail regardless of what our nation of origin might happen to be. And I'd emphasize that. Hanna-Mette, I did have another question come in, which I'm happy to read if that's okay with you.
Please do. Thanks.
Really, it was a two-part question. One is about the challenges of the investor syndicate as it exists and building a new syndicate, and I want to speak to that specifically. And a related question, which is what should the cap table for a Series A look like among for a Norwegian company looking for U.S. capital? And I would say the following. I always counsel companies, and this has nothing to do with Norway. It has to do with every small and early stage company, including those companies that I've started. I've had to give myself the same advice. Be very careful that if you can build a smaller syndicate, an aligned syndicate, if valuation is rational, it allows you to build the next steps of what the cap table will look like. So it's not that a cap table has to look a certain way for a Series A, but if, for example, a founding team has wanted to hold on to as much of the equity as possible or control as possible, and therefore has valuation at the angel round that is so out of whack with what that first real institutional round can look like, because as every investor on the panel said, their job is to return capital to their investors. They have to have an exit. They have to have an exit multiple that works. And if the valuation is out of whack, even if it's a great value proposition, they can't invest. So build that early syndicate very carefully. Try not to have a huge cast of characters. Try not to have an out of whack valuation. And also try to have everyone who is on that early stage understand that institutional investors need to come in with certain types of terms, with governance terms around the board, with governance terms around the form of the equity. Participating preferred is very likely to be the vehicle. And that can sometimes be at great odds with a group of angels. Now, if you're building a small medical device company that doesn't need to go into clinical trials, maybe you can afford to have a lot of angels and never take in institutional capital. If you're building a biotech or a health tech or a medtech that you're going to have to prove commercialization and regulatory and everything, you're going to need a lot of capital, and that usually outstrips the angel investors. So as we've said 100 times on this conference, begin with the end in mind and build the steps. And as I've always said, it is much better to own 1% of Google than it is 100% of a hot dog stand in Central Park in New York City that only becomes a hot dog stand. And that's just, I think, a principle that we see over and over again.
And that was an excellent piece of advice, Jonathan. Scaling the investor syndicate to the type of company that you are planning to build.
Right.
And also having early discussions, that's also something I think is very important for the Norwegian companies and the Nordic companies to actually dare going into discussions with potential counterpart and very early, basically, and be very open on which stage you are and why you are reaching out.
Let me expand on that a little bit as well, Hannemann. And I want to be sensitive to time because I know it's getting late in the day in Norway. But and again, I've started 3 companies in my life in addition to Back Bay and in addition to seeing all the ones on the investor side as well. And the hardest thing in the world is to know when to speak to people. The hardest thing in the world really is to raise capital. It's an incredibly tough job. And there are really 2 categories. There are those people that you can reach out to and will never respond. And then, you meet them again when, it's exactly the time to raise capital. That's actually not the relationship you want. From an investor perspective, I would tell you, the earlier we get to know companies, the better. And what you should at the very least expect from an investor is an honest answer. If it just isn't a fit, if it's too early, if we don't have the bandwidth, at least expect a polite response, and you should get one. You deserve one. You're incredibly hardworking as entrepreneurs. But if you can engage in discussion with somebody who is interested in your value proposition, even if you're not ready for their investment criteria, that's to both sides benefit. It benefits the investor because trust is just such a cornerstone of a good investment. Back Bay, we see the same thing. Even if you are not ready to license, to partner, to be acquired, having those discussions early. Yes, you don't have to share everything because there may be proprietary elements you don't want to share, but developing those trusted relationships, organizing the way you approach your marketplace is critical. And I will say, even at Back Bay, we frequently engage with companies in an informal way and build up the relationship, and they become incredibly valued clients of ours down the line. So that dialogue, that trust should be the cornerstone of the way we interact. And I will say, as somebody who's worked in the Nordics for 15 plus years, one of the things I love about working in the Nordics is that there is an intrinsic candor and an intrinsic trust that I think goes into just pretty much every relationship. And that's something I have always, on a personal level, deeply valued. So I can stop with that because I do know we're bumping up on time.
Yes, we are a few minutes over time now. So even if I would have loved to continue talking, we shouldn't, on respect of the audience. But then again, I would also challenge the audience if they would like to continue discussing with any of you in the philosophy of the conclusion here, to reach out and connect to you.
I'd be very, very pleased to do so. And I know all the panelists would be as well.
So thanks a lot, and thanks for a very interesting 1.5 hours. And we look forward to our continued relationships as members in the cluster. We as well, and we very much appreciate the chance to be with you this afternoon in Norway and this morning here in Boston. Thanks, Hannemann. Take care. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Thank you, everyone.